Greetings, my friends, and welcome to our Sunday morning sermon hour, or, well, sermon half hour, whatever it usually amounts to. Just wanted to welcome you, and again to say that I hope you're all doing well and taking care of yourselves. One of the things that's most important that I learned this past week is the importance of staying hydrated. Most of us aren't as active and not going about the regular routines, and maybe sometimes that changes our appetite, our thirst, etc., etc. So it's important to remember to, try to eat and to maintain hydration and things like that. So that's my little public service announcement for today. Please take care of yourselves in all ways. You may also notice I've stopped, I shaved to see, I haven't seen my face unshaved in a while, so I thought I'd try it today. But I am definitely going to need a haircut when this is all over. I don't know how long the hair will be before this is over, but we'll see. I don't know. Anyway, enough of all that. I also wanted to mention, as I said, we're, about 2 months and going into this situation, and we're not sure what end in sight there may be. There's talks of reopening and, various changes that could be coming in the near future. But I know that this is a time that can cause some stress, anxiety, fear for people. And I wanted you to know that I'm aware of that. I do keep you all in prayer. But if any of you do need to contact me by email, phone, etc., and need to discuss some of these issues, please feel free to do so. We are all in this together, and it's important that we remember our spiritual connection with one another as a community of faith. And I hope we reach out to each other. I hope some of you are all reaching out to each other, phone calls, whatever you can do for each other. And several people in the church I know are very active in trying to make sure that people's needs are taken care of. They've, expressing concern, and that, there are people you can reach out to for help if you need somebody to run to the grocery store for you or the pharmacy or something maybe. But just know that all that is available, okay? So having said all that, our reading today is from the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 15 to 32. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving instructions to have Silas and Timothy join him as soon as possible, they left him. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he debated in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also, some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because Paul was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands. Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God, perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." And may God speak to us through these verses today. True story. I love coming up with true stories like these. I find interesting ones. But back during the famous gold rush days, 1800s, there was a young man who had dreams of becoming rich. So he sold his family farm in Massachusetts, and he moved west across the country in search of gold. But he never found it. Meanwhile, the man who bought the farm from him was out in the fields one day when he noticed something shiny in the ground. He started digging, and he found a chunk of silver worth over $100,000. Those are $1,800,000 too. Now, this young man who sold the farm, he had worked that field for many years, but he never noticed the shiny rock. He never noticed the treasure right under his feet. Instead, he went looking for riches in other places, but never found them. Now, in our reading from the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul tells us that he tells this group of people that God is as close to them as that chunk of silver was to the young man who walked over it every day, but that they don't realize it. Now, Paul is in the city of Athens, Greece, and he's at a place called the Areopagus. The Areopagus was the highest court of law and justice in the city of Athens. It was convened up on top of this very high rocky hill. Now, it was also, in addition to a law court, it was also where the great thinkers of the day would gather to discuss and debate. And it seems that it is this group of philosophers and intellectuals that Paul meets there. Athens had once been the greatest city of the ancient world. That had shifted now to Rome. But it had been the home of great architecture like the Acropolis, full of statues of precious metals and stones. It was the home of great writers and philosophers like Plato and Socrates. There were temples there. Again, the Greeks, like the Romans, worshipped many gods. There were temples to gods like Zeus and Apollo and Poseidon, and altars to many other gods. Now, Paul was walking through the streets, and he saw in all this, he had kind of a mixed feeling about it. For one thing, he had this dislike or disapproval of idols to gods that were not real. But at the same time, he recognized the fact that there were so many altars, so many gods, so much religious practice, these people were religious, that he saw this as a search for truth. He saw it as a search for meaning. He saw it as a search for the divine. That leads him to think, well, I have kind of an opening here with these folks. Paul even saw, we're told, an altar that was dedicated to an unknown god. As I said, the Athenians worshipped many gods, but they wanted to make sure they didn't miss any gods out there. So, just in case, they kept an altar for a god they had never heard of. This provides Paul with the opening to tell them about Jesus Christ and the God revealed in him. Now, Paul may have thought to himself, you know, they are so close to finding the truth. Their minds are open. They are searching. They do just need maybe someone to point them in the right direction. Now, one thing that kind of stands out in this story for me is we notice that when Paul goes to these people, he does not burst in there like some fiery street corner evangelist calling them sinners and pagans. Instead, he is polite. And in fact, it seems like he's kind of willing to meet them where they are in their thinking, their beliefs, etc. Athenians, he says, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. I've seen your objects of worship. I even found an altar to an unknown God. But I'm here to tell you that what you worship as unknown, this is what I'm here to tell you about, to proclaim to you. Now, I mentioned that Paul is addressing a group of intellectuals, but Paul is an intellectual himself. He's very intelligent, he's very well read, he was a high-ranking Pharisee, and in fact, Paul's even able to quote some of their own Greek poets to them. And these poets said that we live and move and have our being in God, and that we are God's offspring. Paul essentially is telling them, look, you've looked everywhere for God, but you haven't found God, not really. God is closer than you may think, and even some of your own thinkers, your own writers, have discovered that truth. Now, one commentator says that in those days, it was not that strange to say God lives within us, that God even in fact lives within everything. That was a rather common belief system. But it was not common to claim the opposite, that we live in God. To live and move and have our being in God is meant to be a very widespread statement, a kind of comprehensive outlook on life. It's saying that every aspect of our existence is sustained by our life in God. It's almost as if we were saying that if we were fish, God would be the ocean. Now, they also say that we are God's offspring, another way of saying God's children, God being the source of us. And as for us being God's offspring, it means God is the source of our existence, and that in our very nature, we are like God. The biblical concept of being made in the image of God. It's not an exact image, it's not as if we are equal to God, but that we reflect in a very limited human way qualities and aspects of God that really no other creature on earth can. Now, Paul takes these quotes from these Greek writers, and he's actually made them part of our Holy Scriptures. They're right there in the book of Acts. They're quoted many, many times. Paul makes these other writings, these other material from another culture, part of our understanding of God. Paul goes on to explain that such a God as this, a God in whom we live and move and have our being, a God that is the source of our existence, that a God like that can never be portrayed by an idol. It cannot, that kind of God cannot be portrayed by a picture, a statue, etc. To be honest, my friends, all images of God fall short. All images of God try in essence, they limit what is, we might say, unlimited. And we may sometimes ourselves fall into the trap of believing that God is no bigger or deeper than our own ideas about God. That happens a lot. We develop a concept of God and we can't imagine another, or what doesn't fit into that belief system we've maybe come up with. We throw it out. It doesn't fit in, so, the image we have of God starts determining, those sorts of ideas. But the problem is, again, being limited human beings, any belief we have about God, any image we have about God, any idea, whatever, about God, is only a limited understanding of God. Now, one writer says that Paul's message could be summed up this way, telling the Athenians, "If you yourselves, with images of gold and silver, try to imagine that you're going to find God that way, you're mistaken." In fact, this writer says that they should listen to the deepest fact of their own being, that they should be silent in the presence of the mystery of what you are, and then look out beyond to the unknown God that I declare to you. Now, how did the Athenians react to Paul in his statements? Well, we're told some thought they were ridiculous. They laughed at them. We're told some doubted. But we're also told that some of them said, "We want to hear more about this." Historically, we know that because of Paul, a church was established there in Athens, and some of the greatest Christian leaders eventually came from there. If we think about ourselves today, like the ancient Greeks, we also live in a time of vast knowledge, scientific advances, things that those ancient Athenians, as smart as they were, cultured as they were, things that they could never have dreamt of. Even so, with all of our knowledge today, all of our ability to access practically any information there is in the world, we do still seem to search for truth and meaning. We are searching, most of us, all of us, for something that will satisfy needs that we have, that will calm fears that we have. We are searching for answers to what often seem like unanswerable questions. And Paul's message for us today is that, indeed, God is closer than we may think, but many times we may be looking in the wrong places. God is not far from each one of us, says Paul. We live and move and have our being in God, and we are God's offspring. Now that is a great hope. That is a true meaning for life. And it was the message that Paul had for his world, and it's the message that we have for our world. But Paul also understood that that message had to be heard, and it had to be heard in language and images that people could comprehend, that made sense to them. Those Athenians did not know Jewish theology, scripture. If they did, it was only maybe a passing familiarity or a very academic familiarity, but it was not a religious system. They were not the scriptures that they really participated in. And frankly, if Paul simply started quoting scripture and using beliefs from his own culture, it would have made little sense to the Athenians. That's why he smartly used their own ideas and their own philosophies. He even uses their literature to open up the gospel for them, to show them that they are not far from knowing God, because God was actually speaking to them through their own books and their own teachers. Now, it has been pointed out that we religious people, we Christians, very involved Christians, that we can no longer really expect people, especially young people, to be familiar with the Bible and with the basic beliefs of our faith. We just can't. Many people today are not able to relate to stories of ancient kings and desert nomads in a faraway land. We have to help people hear God speaking to them through the things in their lives as well. We need to help them hear God speaking to them through the things that they read and listen to, the things that they think about. We need to help them discover how near God truly is to them in their everyday lives. After all, if God is the source of everything, if God is living within everything, then God is not just in our Bible and our churches. God is also in our novels, in our movies, our music, our TV shows. God is in our politics and economics. And as Paul shows us, God can even be heard in the philosophies and religions of other cultures. Now, Paul once said that in the interest of spreading the gospel, he became all things to all people. He was willing to adapt. He was willing to try to understand other people, to meet them where they were, rather than demand that they come and meet him where he is. He was willing to do everything he could to help people find God. And so it should be for us. Now, my friends, this is sort of one of the reasons why, for example, when I preach a sermon, that over the years I've been doing this, I've used examples from TV shows like Seinfeld. I've used quotes from books by Stephen King. I've drawn on contemporary music, the Beatles and other people, as illustrations in my sermons, as ways of highlighting a point or something like that. It's because there are things in the world that do reveal God to us or can speak in some way to us that illustrates that this universality of God, the fact that God is in everything. God is not confined simply to religion. We sometimes make that mistake of trying to confine God to our religion. But God is bigger than that. The history of Israel, the biblical history of Israel, is bigger than that. Every time they thought they had God figured out, God would lead them in some new direction, reveal some new truth to them, and so on. Their religion at that point would either have to grow to accept and welcome and process this new way, or some people would just simply reject it. Now, that's something, again, that still happens today. There are religious people that are open to new concepts and are willing to see beyond our own faith system, our own writings, and so on, to recognize that God is bigger than all of those things. But also there are people who say, no, if it's not in the Bible, I'm not going to believe it, or if it's not in the Bible, it's not worth, it's not sacred, or if it's not part of Christianity, then it must not be true, and so on. I don't think Paul wants us to look at it that way. I also don't believe Jesus wants us to look at it that way. Jesus would frequently point out people of great faith. In fact, he would say they had greater faith than his own people, and they were of other religions and other cultures. So, this story today is an attempt, Paul is trying to show us, to search out God in ways, especially if we're going to preach and proclaim God, to find ways that people can relate to, that is some sort of contact point or a way of turning on that little light bulb in them. Oh, I may have, read this or heard that or watched this so many times, but I never thought of it this way, or I never saw that religious aspect to it, or that theological point that's in there. We need to start looking at everything around us. The shows that we watch, the movies we attend, hopefully again someday. Again, all the things that we experience, as we read them, we may want to be asking ourselves constantly, what is God trying to show me through this? And it may seem that whatever it is we're doing, well, surely God's not in this, or this couldn't speak to me in a religious way. But maybe if we look at it again differently, if we approach it again differently with this more open understanding, we may find a whole new world opening up to us, and a very different way of comprehending and relating to God. And of course, as our ways of understanding and relating to God change and grow, so do our ways of relating to one another change and grow. They are connected together. My friends, God is the truth, the meaning, the hope, the promise in which we live and move and have our being. We are God's offspring. We are the children of God, as promised in our scriptures, as promised by our faith, as promised to us by Jesus Christ. Live in that knowledge today. Act and speak in a way that honors that truth. And in all things, give God glory and praise and thanks. Amen.